The nimzo-Indian defense is one of the most reliable as well as strategically rich defenses to d4. We reach this fascinating opening after the moves d4, taking space in the center. In response to d4, black can play the solid d5, taking a fair share of the center, but black can also remain flexible with knight f6, developing the knight as well as preventing e4. In response to knight f6, white typically takes more space in the center with c4. Controlling as much of the center as possible, black signals the possibility of a nimzo-Indian defense by playing e6, supporting the center as well as preparing to develop the dark-squared bishop. If white continues with the classical knight c3, developing the knight and preparing to take more space with e4, instead of playing d5, turning the game into the classical queen's gambit declined, we reach the nimzo-Indian after black plays bishop b4, pinning the c3 knight, which prevents e4 for the time being. The nimzo-Indian is a strategically rich opening with several plans available for both sides. Instead of trying to memorize several variations, it's a better idea to focus on understanding the typical themes and ideas in the opening. We can see a direct clash of ideas with the move a3, turning the game into the Zamish variation. Before black has a chance to consider retreating the bishop at a later stage, white spends a tempo to claim the bishop pair, provoking bishop takes c3 check. B takes c3. White now has the bishop pair, a long-term advantage, but must accept a worse pawn structure, especially the doubled c-pawns, an isolated pawn on a3, which denies the dark-squared bishop the possibility of playing bishop a3 for the time being. In these type of structures, white will often dream to play e4, grabbing more central space and trying to open up lines for the bishop pair. Black, on the other hand, needs to decide how to target white's center. Adding pressure against d4 is a common theme, so it's no surprise that black will often play c5, striking against d4 and trying to provoke another concession in white's pawn structure. If white plays d takes c5, creating isolated, tripled pawns, black may continue with knight a6, preparing to capture the c5 pawn. Or else black may play queen a5, attacking c5 and c3 at the same time. If white decides to take space with d5, black can stabilize the center with d6, preventing the d5 pawn from advancing and revealing the light-squared bishop's protection of e6. By playing d5, white's doubled c-pawns are fixed in place, and although they do help support the center, they are fixed weaknesses white needs to keep in mind. In response to c5, a common idea for white is to support the center with e3. This solid move supports the d4 pawn. The dark-squared bishop is now out of play for the time being, but white hopes to later expand in the center with e4 to liberate this piece once the center proves stable enough to do so. Black continues with the strategy to add pressure against d4 with knight c6, when white can activate the light-squared bishop with bishop d3, centralizing the bishop as well as supporting a future e4. Black can remain flexible and castle the king. White may decide to develop somewhat automatically with knight f3, but an interesting twist is knight e2. From the e2 square, the knight supports the center and allows the f-pawn to advance and take more space. A sensible continuation for black is d6, protecting the c5 pawn and allowing black to play e5 in the future if it proves desirable. Moving the pawn to e3 is often played with the short-term goal of supporting the d4 pawn as well as allowing kingside development, but the e-pawn has a lust for expansion, which we see with e4, taking space in the center as well as opening up the dark-squared bishop. Black could try to block the center with e5, but an instructive idea for black is to play the strange-looking but positionally motivated knight e8, avoiding an annoying pin with bishop g5, as well as preparing to meet f4 with f5, after white castles the king, moving the king to safety and positioning the rook to support f4, f5 ideas. This is a good moment for black to focus on queenside play with b6. This move helps support the c5 pawn, which blockades white's doubled c-pawns. And attacking c4 is a common strategy for black in several lines in the nimzo. Black prepares to play bishop a6, followed by knight a5, intensifying pressure against the c4 pawn. After b6, white is not interested to simply sit around and wait for this to happen, so white expands on the king side with f4. Black should not ignore white's idea and automatically play bishop a6, as f5 begins a dangerous kingside attack. Black can slow down white's kingside ambitions with f5, The f4 pawn is now stopped in its tracks, and the f5 pawn now restricts the light-squared bishop. Since the f4 pawn cannot advance, this means that white's dark-squared bishop remains less active. Black will be able to create good counterplay against white's broad center, but white is certainly not without resources as well. One idea to consider is d5, taking space in the center, and adding pressure against black's light squares. Another option to consider is knight g3, adding pressure against f5, as well as increasing the mobility of the queen on d1. In this tension-filled position, both sides have plenty of resources to explore.